Hello and welcome back to the Blush Studio. Today I'm going to take you through my watercolor leaf process. Now, if you've been with me for a while, you're probably pretty familiar with this process, but I decided it was time for me to go a little bit more in depth. This is really the piece where I kind of really started to create this process, this formula, if you will, and I've been using it ever since. I'm using my current favorite leaf combination, which is Jadeite Genuine by Daniel Smith and Yellow Ochre. I love that the deep, rich green plays with, like the golden yellow tone that is so iconic with Yellow Ochre. So I'll be pulling those in. I'll also be pulling in an amethyst color, as well as some cadmium red. And you'll see that throughout the piece. Now, I don't have like a tutorial here for the pear itself. We'll actually just be focusing on the leaves today, so I can talk through kind of my process, why I, am painting things the way that I am in order to get a style that is kind of, it's a mix between realism, but it still has the illustrative style that I love so much. Now, the reason I picked the amethyst rather than like a red tone, oh, I stand corrected. I thought it was cadmium red, but based on what I just pulled, it looks like it was the Daniel Smith Deep Scarlet. Okay, so I've already done the first wash for my pear, and you can see that I have the light source coming from the right, which is very important, and I need to keep that in mind while I'm working on the leaves themselves. I'm going to do a light wash of the green that I've mixed. So again, this is the Jadeite green, Jadeite Genuine by Daniel Smith, and the Yellow Ochre mix, and I have it pretty heavy on the Yellow Ochre to keep it nice and warm tone, but it still has a lot of the saturation of the Daniel Smith paint. So it's actually a pretty bright color, especially compared to what we end up with. This tone was really rather bright, and I'm just doing a wash here, but I'm kind of applying it in such a way so that hopefully when it dries, it will help to already establish where the shadows are for this painting. So you'll see that I'm kind of picking up paint on one side, but allowing it to rest a little more heavily on sections that will naturally be in shadow. That way it just kind of, it's just a way to start applying, even if it's just like a note for myself, establishing where those shadows are going to be. See how I'm applying a little bit more here, but I want it to be nice and soft and pretty blended out. So that's why I'm messing with it while the pigment is still wet on this paper. And I don't have a lot of time with this paper, which is the Strathmore 300 series. It doesn't stay wet for a really long time, so I do need to work quickly. So you'll see I just do this for every single leaf that we have in this composition. I'm just going to go over everything. I'll also talk you through kind of how I'm doing the stem and like the twig of these leaves as well. Now, something you might notice that I'm doing is I'm also taking the green up this, like the stem of the leaf into the actual twig or the little branch that it's connected to. And I'll kind of allow the green to pop through when I add the brown for the twig itself, and I just find that that helps with the transition. It helps it look a little bit more natural rather than being too blunt. So occasionally when I do something like this, or at least when I've done it more recently, I will kind of pop in another color here while the paint is still wet, just to kind of allow it to blend nicely and create just some interesting dimension in there. I decided not to do that this time, but like the leaf that I just finished, I might now add a little bit of the Yellow Ochre that I've mixed for the pear, that yellow warm tone, and just tap it in right next to that leaf where the pear would naturally have some reflected light there. Again, I didn't do that this time, but that was something that I might do now. The great thing about watercolor is that, and art in general, is there are times when you can like follow a rule or a method that you've established for yourself, but you don't have to do it every single time. It can kind of come and go. It can be something that's part of your style, but you don't necessarily do every single time. Okay, unfortunately I didn't catch myself mixing what I used for the stem, but if I had to guess, I would say it was probably Hematite Genuine by Daniel Smith, yellow ochre, a little bit of raw sienna. I might have thrown in some of the green in there just to cool it down, so the green that I've already mixed. I'm generally one of those people who likes to use colors that I'm already using within my palette and just mixing them together in different percentages in order to create the color that I want, especially if I'm going for like a brown and I'm working with colors that are complementary. So if I had to guess, that's probably what I did, but I would say just kind of like play around with it. This is more of a cool tone, which is why I think I probably added quite a bit of the green in there, just to help keep it very cool, even though I know for sure that there was some raw sienna mixed in there. So what I'm doing, I already applied kind of a quick wash, but I know I want this to be kind of loose and expressive and very painterly. So I'm going through, and as that wash has dried, I'm just adding, you know, like these dark pops. And again, I'm not being super specific or making sure that these are blended super well, because I really want it to be very expressive and painterly and kind of loose. I'm just trying to establish like where the shadows are, how this, you know, interesting section of the pear kind of bends and, you know, goes in two different directions without kind of overpowering the piece. Now I'm going to take that same color and I'm going to apply it to the twigs, the stems of my greenery, and I'm also going to drag it through a little bit on the leaves just to establish where that central vein would be. It also will help me as I'm, you know, working on this piece to kind of figure out and remember, keeping in mind so I don't get too distracted, you know, where the shape of this leaf is pointing and kind of what direction he's going in. Going a little off screen, we'll be back in just a sec. Here we go. So again, I'm just being really soft. This is just the first wash. I don't want to get too dark too quickly because then it's really hard to establish those shadows that I want to mimic just like I did on the stem. So especially with when you're working with something that is so thin, it's important not to get too dark too quickly, or else it can really just look like the whole thing is in shadow, which is definitely not the direction I'm going for. I do want there to be some contrast, especially between the stem and the leaves. I want one to definitely be darker than the other, but if I get too dark too fast, there's not really a lot that I can do when it comes to watercolor, because watercolor is so transparent, it doesn't layer well to lighten, or really at all. So for this, I believe I'm using my number 4 round brush. I definitely was flirting back between like my number 4 and some on my number 6. And I know, at least for the pear, my favorite was the number 8. But right here, I'm definitely using my number 4, and I'm just establishing those shadows. So I'm working on the one side because my light source is from my right hand side. So I know that the shadow would be on the left hand side, and just keeping that consistent with all of the stems. The nice thing that I can kind of go on autopilot for this, because it's pretty simple to get that shadow established. So I'm just doing that here, kind of giving the twig a little bit more depth and dimension, and then we'll start playing around a little bit more with the leaves themselves. As you can see, this is not a super fast process, but I found that just taking my time, even though it's very simple, has really paid off. And I'll continue to kind of build this up. So the stem, the twigs themselves, that takes maybe 3 passes. So like this would be the second pass, and then I go through and add kind of some highlighted colors. So right here, I'm adding a little bit of green just to kind of tie it in with the greenery. And to give it a little bit more life, because you know, usually when we look at brown things versus green things, we usually consider the green things to be the living. So I'm kind of doing that here. I'm just adding little bits of the green in areas that are kind of being highlighted, just to kind of help it to pop a little bit. Not a lot. There's barely any pigment and barely any water on my brush when I'm doing this. And that's so that the color is there, but it's not super distracting. It's one of those things that really you'd only notice if you're looking up close, but it helps to unify the piece. And you hear me talk about that a lot. It's just something that is really part of my style, is just repeating these colors, working with more limited palette, and finding ways that color like bounces off each other, and it's very reflective and very relational. My style when I work with color is really built on that relationship and how yeah, the colors like play together. Now here I added a little bit more of the purple to my brown just to deepen it up a little bit. So I'm adding these like really pops of, to the shadows. So whatever's closest to the lemon, that would be underneath and under a shadow, or any like corners that really need a little bit more of a pop. I'm going through now, and again, my brush is mostly dry. It's a little bit damp and it's got a little bit of pigment on it, so it's just kind of a soft glaze rather than a lot of thick paint. And you can see how just doing these little steps, it just brings this twig, this stem to life. I mean, look at it compared, and like the stem of the pear compared to everything else. There's so much more life to it, and even though up close it looks like just kind of a lot of colors and different shapes, as you step back, it just brings everything together. There's a lot more depth and dimension. I love like these interesting sections where like the twig is cut off. And I love kind of adding a little bit more detail to that, just again to kind of give that illusion of depth and make something that's a little bit more interesting. All right, now it's time to work on the greenery itself. I want you to be able to see my palette a little bit because I'll be pulling from that. I'm going to start off the same way I started off with the stems, where I'm just kind of adding that shadow. So I'm really just going in with the same color that I started with not a lot of paint on my brush, just enough to really kind of add that next layer. I grabbed some yellow because right above this leaf is the lemon, and so, or the pear. Lemon yellow is mixed in with this color, but right above it is the pear, so it would have that reflected color, or just kind of like pop up. I'm also, as I'm mixing this green, so I'm putting the green down, I've pulled a little bit of red. That's to help desaturate it, but I don't want it to blend in with the green too much. I kind of want it to be its own color and have its own life to it. And I'll add a little bit more to it later. I'm really at this point trying to decide how saturated I want it to be and how much I want it to have kind of a shining roll. Going back again, now that that first layer is a little bit more dry, just to deepen this section that would be in more of a shadow. To make it a little bit darker, I've added some of the amethyst to the green. That helps to desaturate it as well as bring the color down just a touch. And adding a little bit of red to the tips to help it to pop. And you'll see I'll kind of be jumping back and forth between the leaves just as they're starting to dry, to add another layer of color or to kind of help to add some more saturation to something. And as I'm like kind of deciding how to add the colors. Like right here I just popped in quite a bit of the amethyst purple mixed in with the green. And so I was kind of going back and forth because it was just a little bit too saturated for my liking. Because even though that leaf is going to be in quite a bit of a shadow with the pear right over it, I don't want it to become like I don't want it to get too dark, because then it would be kind of something that would pull your eye too much towards that area. In art, I usually refer to it as like a bullseye. You don't really want anything to be a bullseye that's not the focal point, or like a bullet hole in your painting where it's just kind of, it draws the eye of the viewer, but it's not supposed to be something super interesting. But that can happen if you get too dark too fast. I see that a lot when people are first starting out with their shading. Their gradients won't be soft or gradual. It'll just kind of look like they tore a hole in their paper. So that's something that with watercolor I also want to be careful with. Now occasionally you'll see me go just like this off screen, and that just means that I'm dabbing my brush off on the rag that I have. And I just keep that on hand for when I'm working with details like this, and if my brush gets too wet or has too much pigment on it, I'll just kind of dab it off on the brush or on that rag in order to keep the pigment there, but it's not so saturated. That's something that I've kind of always done, and you've probably, if you've watched one of my tutorials before, you've heard me mention that. But it's something that I find, people will ask me a lot, like, how much water do I have on? Like, they're looking for a formula, and, it's exactly 1/16 of a tablespoon on a size 8 brush. It's not really like that. You just kind of go with the flow, and if you're realizing, you know what, I don't have as much control as I want, or it's going too fast, or it's too dark, just take the water off. Whether you're dabbing it on a brush and then dabbing it on a towel and then taking the now dry brush and picking up some of that pigment, it's kind of a trial and error, and even one of those things that, despite the fact that I've been doing this a lot and working in this style a lot, I still have to go back and dab it off. There's not really like an exact formula. It's just kind of going off of what's working and what's not working. So see, I went and dabbed it off again. I was working a little bit more wet because I was blending the amethyst with the green mixture that I had, and I wasn't sure how much. I'm just adding more, but then I go dab it off to help blend it in together. Adding a little bit of yellow in that corner just to add some personality and a little bit of a highlight, even though that leaf is behind the one that I'm now painting on. I don't want it to be too dark or in too much of a shadow. So about now is when I decided I really was loving the mixture of the amethyst with the green. I had been playing around with mixing it with the deep scarlet that we had pulled out earlier and had mixed with the yellow that I used on the pear. But I just found that it was still too saturated, and I'll end up using that in a different way. But to desaturate the green to get that good shadow, I just found that I was really loving the purple mixed in with it. Now, purple is a split complement for green, and so it will help to desaturate the color without completely losing the vibrance of the green and kind of that personality in there. So it's a good way to cut down the intensity without losing all the personality. But I am going to take some of that red, again that is Deep Scarlet by Daniel Smith, and I'm just popping it on the ends, and I'm keeping it pretty saturated. You'll see when I zoom in later that there's just this pop of this unexpected red tone in some of my leaves, and I've been doing that a lot with different medium that I'm working with, media. So I do it a ton with my colored pencil work, and I just started doing it with watercolor, and I don't know why I didn't do that before. So I'll continue to follow this formula and these steps throughout the rest of the leaves. Where it's mostly water and a little bit of pigment, and then I dry my brush off and I pick up the color where it's gotten too dark. And that's just that's more of a wet on wet technique. And you can see I'm adding a little bit of that red, just a pop here, just to add a little bit of personality, and then a little yellow. And I'll just continue to build up the depth and the intensity. I found that later I really preferred adding the yellow last as a very soft glaze, but at least at this point I was still kind of playing around with what order to do everything in. And I mean, I guess that's the great part. It didn't really matter how I did it, but I just ended up preferring having the yellow as kind of like a final step instead of trying to kind of fit it in here in the middle. So you can see I'm being really fussy with all of this. I'm really allowing myself to play around and experiment with the modeling of these leaves. I really want to get this right, but I also am working on kind of that balance between having everything really blended, but also allowing just the shapes to show, which is something that I've been playing with more with watercolor. It's not really something that I do with my other media. I'm usually kind of stuck on blending. So I've just really enjoyed like allowing that aspect of watercolor to show through and not being so concerned about everything being as perfectly blended as I might normally want them to be. You can see in the leaves down here, there's like some defined shapes, and that's kind of what I've been experimenting with this piece, is just allowing those shapes to be there and to exist. And you know, it's one of those things that as you step back from it, you don't notice it as much, and that can be its own style and its own beauty. But I still got to blend it out a little bit. I mean, I am who I am. Here I'm just deepening up the sections that I've already gone over, allowing the leaves that I just finished to dry, and kind of establishing what the contrast is going to be for these leaves throughout the composition. Because I want it to be consistent and not look like, you know, the leaves in one section are, you know, have more contrast or less contrast, or you know, the leaves in another section are brighter than the others. I want it to be nice and consistent, so that's one of the reasons I kind of go back and forth. It also helps to allow the leaves to dry, and so I can kind of see and assess what needs to be done. So you can see here on the tip of this one, I've added that red that we've mixed with the deep scarlet and the yellow ochre. And that just kind of helps to add like a little bit of a little pop of interest. And I'll have to go back through and add a little bit more later because I realized it wasn't getting dark enough, so I had to go over it a little bit with the green and the amethyst. But I did, you know, kind of go back, add that red back in to kind of get that little bit of a pop. You'll see that I'm adding it in areas that I want to, you know, like really draw some attention there and add a little bit of really, it's like in music when there's like dissonance in music, it's a little bit of tension to draw the eye. So a lot of times I'll use it on like the tips, or there's a broken piece of a leaf coming up and I put the red around that. And that's, again, just to kind of in a subtle way draw the eye. It's not, you know, like a red siren that I'm just like putting out there, but it is, you know, it is going to kind of, yeah, add that tension and therefore add some emphasis. It's definitely interesting to watch myself do this because sometimes I'll pick up a lot of the pigment or blend it out a lot, and in my head watching it I'm like, why did you do that? And you know, it's just one of those things that for me, I do a lot of very small, very light layers. And sometimes it's annoying because it just takes more time. But I've just found that I have more control. I'm a little bit more comfortable doing it this way. Maybe if I was able to do watercolor full time, then I would be more comfortable already with this technique and just painting in general. See, I added a little bit of red to that tip there. But at this point, I'd rather go in very slow layers. And even what I'm showing you now has been sped up a little bit. I did speed up this video just for the sake of respecting your time because it's just slow going. So you may have noticed that I jumped a little bit. Again, I'm just kind of repeating the process over and over again, and so I don't want to be too repetitive with this content, with this video. Right now I'm going through and I'm just adding a little bit of like really it's almost pure amethyst, and that is just to get these very deepest sections. That's just the darkest color really that I'm using in general, and so I'm going in pretty heavy with it. So there's not a lot of water on this brush, quite a bit of pigment so that I can really get it nice and saturated, and just that little bit, just in these blocked shapes, not blended out too much, really helps to add the contrast that I'm going for. It helps to, the leaves that are behind, it really helps to push the leaves, in front of them forward, and to, put the proper hierarchy in place. Adding a little bit more of that yellow reflective color. So I just continued to repeat this process until we got the finished look. So I love how piecey it is and how organic. You can see there's a lot of shapes in there, but there's a ton of color play. These leaves in my reference photo, to be honest, were not this interesting, but I love that with illustration, you don't always have to do exactly what's there. You can kind of play with it, especially as you get to understand color theory more and more. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, you found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to give me a thumbs up or leave a comment down below with any questions that you have. And until next time, happy painting.